Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Good, glad to hear it. Today we're going to be talking about some of the ideas in Ayn Rand's famous essay for the New Intellectual.
Right. So this article was published in her book called For the New Intellectual in 1961. And it basically introduces her concept of the new intellectual. But it begins with a sort of history of intellectuals or ideas and people who create ideas throughout history. And then also the archetypes of Attila and the Witch Doctor, which
Right.
she argues is very important in history because they started this evil influence over cultures and created a lot of the problems that we see today. And she believes these archetypes are still being used or applied in today's world.
All right, well, good. Well, we're actually doing this in two parts. I think the first, we're going to talk about her take on Attila and the Witch Doctor and how useful as a tool of identification and archetypes that's been. And we'll kind of leave her take on history for the next one. For me, just before we really jump into things, I just think that since reading for the New Intellectual and coming to value the intellectual, over time, I have seen, different pieces of history. Like, for example, that it was Lenin that changed from Marx. Marx thought it was going to be a workers' revolution, but Lenin was promoting the idea of an intellectual vanguard that would take the intellectuals. And I think to some extent, even before Lenin, there was a kind of almost a fetishization of intellectuals in general as being this kind of superior class. And that probably goes on even pre the Enlightenment. I mean, you could argue it's somewhat Platonic in the sense that, Plato wanted these kind of philosopher kings that these higher minds were trained from the beginning. It's interesting that by the time of Cambodia's communism, they were actually targeting intellectuals. So, I want to also in this kind of review Rand's, you know, appreciation for intellectuals and what qualifies as an intellectual and what that even means in today's context.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Plato because I think the concept of an archetype can be considered very Platonic. It's kind of like this first form. I mean, if you go by the etymology, it literally means like the first form or the first mold from which copies are made. So it has this sort of Platonic ideal sort of connotation to it. And I happen to think that it's kind of a mistake to start with these archetypes, but I believe Rand was trying to get at a very fundamental concept or theory about how ideas are created and then spread and then used throughout cultures or throughout history. So I think the more appropriate classifications would be first the creator of an idea, and then the spreader, the spreader of that idea who distributes it, and then the people who use that idea in practical reality and create things using that idea. So, and then there would be a differentiation among those classifications, sub classifications. So you'd have the manufacturer and the producer and the intellectual and the philosopher and the businessman and the corporation, or you'd have different factions of these ideas. But I think that's generally what Rand was getting at, is that ideas are what's important. Humans create ideas. So
Right.
there's the initial thinker or philosopher who's coming up with ideas. And then there's the like politician or social mover who repeats those ideas to his followers, and then that spreads the ideas around. And then there are people among the flock who actually are doers and like can use that idea and figure out ways to like make a hammer or
Right.
or or send us to the moon on a rocket, you know.
Exactly. When Rand says ideas change the world, I can agree with that, that it's through ideas that make it into technologies, or even, real life ideas that actually make the human condition better. But the idea that it's just, ideas per se, it just I question that. So
Yeah, and there's also different classifications of ideas. You know, you have false ideas and you have true ideas. So I think what she was getting at with the Attila and the Witch Doctor is this sort of what happens when you come up with a false idea and then it spreads and then people start using it in reality. You know,
right.
it turns into poisonous objects or poisonous things that ruin your life and spoil culture and just kill invention or kill creativity or kill thinking. So
Right.
that's kind of what she was getting at with that using those figures as representing the types of people who exist when people abandon reason. Like when you abandon reason and rationality and science, this is what happens. You get Attilas and you get the witch doctors, and all hell breaks loose and chaos forms, and
Well, we have
dog.
a clip of Rand discussing the witch doctor and Attila. Um, this is right after the publication for the New Intellectual came out. And in this clip, Rand discusses the witch doctor.
Since most men, guided by their philosopher, do not wish to think, and they consider thought and reason either dangerous or impotent or too much of an effort. Most human cultures, with very rare exceptions, have been ruled by what I call witch doctors. And a witch doctor is any man who takes his emotions, not his thinking, but his emotions, as his tool of cognition and his guide to reality. He functions by means of faith. He acts on the basis of blind beliefs, which in fact are nothing more than his wishes. He is guided by his wishes, by his whims, which he takes as a guide to reality. No matter on what level of culture you observe him, that type of man is a witch doctor in the sense of his psychoepistemology, of the way he uses his mind.
So this is an example of her giving a description of her archetype, the witch doctor. But in the beginning of her essay, she acknowledges that these archetypes don't exist in reality. They're just a representation of a character. So, and I think she's coming at it in a sort of fictional way. So she's going to describe to you her fictional archetypes, which you can then try to apply or use to represent real people in history. And then later on in her essay, she's going to start talking about actual people like David Hume and Kant, and she'll get into some of the actual intellectual history.
Right.
But so I think this is useful if you're trying to understand the classifications of different types of people. But it's not so useful if you're trying to actually find a witch doctor in reality, because you're not going to find very many people who are full-blown emotionalists who never think or never act rationally.
Right.
You know,
She said herself, you can't be fully inconsistent or you'd be dead, or
yeah.
fully
So
wrong. You have to be inconsistently wrong.
if you're a flaming emotionalist, you're going to die real quick, right? You're not going to survive. So the people who actually exist in reality and survive, they are part-time emotionalists. In some categories of their life, they'll be very emotional and they'll act on their emotions and just do stupid stuff. but they won't let it get to the point of death, like suicide. They're not going to follow their emotions to the grave. At some point they'll limit themselves and they'll stop and say, all right, I need to go to rehab and get my life together, and, and start acting rational. So, and then it works in the opposite way too. Then you have the people up in their ivory towers who are just, thinking up fantasy, coming up with fantasies. Well, that's not going to get them food on the table. So at some point they realize, oh, I got to go get a job and like get some money and put some food on the table. So you don't find these types of people, these archetypes in reality very often. And when you
Right.
do, and when you do, they're basically just launching themselves over a cliff and they're going to die soon.
Well, I guess my issue with it is that, not all religious people are equally mystical. And, like Aquinas, would you call him a witch doctor?
I think what she's getting at is that in some cases, there's the witch doctor who can be sustained by the Attilas who go out and bring food to him. Like, so you have like monks who isolate themselves and don't do anything and rely on charity. And then you have like crazy kids or crazy adults who fly off the handle and are saved by doctors, who are actually there and ready to heal their wounds when they run into a brick wall or something. So there is the case where if you have very successful producers and people who are thinking and know what they're doing, they can save the Attilas and the witch doctors from killing themselves. And this is one of the problems with charity. If you're too charitable to these people who aren't responsible, then we're just going to get more irresponsible people in the world. So you got to
Yeah,
balance. You got to balance it with how much do you care about that person, how much is their life worth, or how much
I
destruction are they going to cause if you save them.
but I mean, yeah, but no one is really the full archetype. That's just going back to your position. But I think that it's been misinterpreted by some of the establishment objectivists to make these sweeping generalizations to say no religious person can be for liberty.
Yeah, and they apply that to people who compartmentalize their religion and and
Right.
and to some degree have completely rejected 90% of the miracles in the Bible. They're
Hmm.
not the old school medieval ages um, believers.
They
A lot
claim that
of
they're still inspired by Augustine, being against knowledge, and that's just not the way modern Christians are. They'd say, "Oh, they're not real Christians." Then, well, that's the point. That's why they're not the same witch doctor you're ascribing to them.
Yeah, and even I mean, you could maybe apply it to some of the hardcore theologians who lock themselves in a building and study texts, ancient texts all day. But those, I mean, what percentage of the population is that? It's not a very big population, very big percentage. Uh,
Probably
most
easier to get away with today.
most Christians who have any influence over the culture at large are these popular preachers who basically don't do what they say. They don't walk the walk. They live in luxurious houses and they buy fancy cars and they preach about making money. You got to make money to give to the church.
Yeah.
So they're coming up with their own blend of modern Christianity, and you rarely hear them talking about turning, the ancient miracles. It's more about what kind of values can you get out of today, and how can we embrace scientific theories without completely destroying our religious belief. Like they basically started to accept evolution. They accept a lot of scientific theories that if you were a fundamentalist Jew or Christian, we would have to reject based on biblical text. But what they're doing now is they're kind of rejecting biblical text or just evading it and starting to embrace scientific facts. Otherwise they just get ostracized from society, because who wants to be friends with a flat earther?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's just my issue, that it's not her per se, but a misinterpretation of her, that they see the followers see the archetypes as real, and they're just using that as kind of a smear to just anyone that's not an objectivist. And actually in this next clip, she discusses Attila.
And since he has to deal with other men, since on the ground of emotions no one can deal with reality nor with people, the natural ally of the witch doctor will always be the type I call Attila. That is the primitive, savage, tribal chief, the man who acts only on the range of the moment, on his immediate sensory perceptions, who is contemptuous of and refuses to consider ideas, principles, or abstractions, and whose way of dealing with reality and with other men is by means of brute force. Attila is either the gangster, or the dictator, or the military conqueror, or any man who believes that force is practical, any man who refuses to think and wishes to loot, enslave, or force others.
This is the archetype of the brute, and I understand what you're saying about people using these archetypes to smear their opponents, and
Right.
I think that's a problem.
I'm against
Primarily,
initiating force, but I've experienced objectivists overusing the Attila label against virtually anyone taking action. When
yeah,
when the much bigger problem today is with people not willing to take action, even when reality and commitment to your higher values calls for it.
yeah, I think this is a problem with rationalization or rationalism. Um, Rationalism, I think there's an element of rationalism in these archetypes. So you have these ideals of evil people. I guess they're evil ideals, evil archetypes, and people think that can be manifested in reality. Like you just get a version of it in reality. But that's platonic. That's not working from objective reality up. It's working from the sky downward. So that's what I was getting at in the beginning. Is I think this is a fundamental problem with starting with the archetypes, is that the followers of Rand are now applying those ideal forms of evil to real people in the real world, who are complex entities who do bad things and do good things, and may not even be aware of following some evil principle. They're just copying people, doing what they think is best in their
Mhm.
mind, but it's actually a bad idea. They don't realize it. And so,
And
yeah,
there's
go ahead.
also the producer and the thinker. I just want to say, I think that sometimes those archetypes can exist in the same person. Someone like a Jeff Bezos, who is a bona fide creator, but at the same time, he's kind of bought into a little bit of the modern woke witch doctoring.
Yeah, I mean, I forget who said it recently, but someone said they thought Elon Musk had multiple personality disorder, because he's a different. I guess he's like a different person when you meet him in reality, and versus his social, you know, presence. So people can have different aspects of their personality that they let loose in one area of their life and then let loose in another area of their life. Or, they like to keep certain things private so you don't see that aspect of them when they're on TV or something.
Right.
So people are they're this complex being. You don't always see every aspect of them. You don't know their context. what they're going through in real life, what values they've chosen and rejected. So sometimes you have this incomplete picture of a real person, and then you use that incomplete picture and try to force it into the mold of one of these archetypes. And that's not going to work because A, you don't have all the facts, and B, you're trying to work from rationalism. You're trying to work from this ideal up in the sky, down to some uh, copy of that. And people
Yeah.
aren't copies. People aren't copies of your fantastic ideals.
If we agree the archetypes don't really exist in reality, then they should just be used as, he's showing Attila like qualities or witch doctor qualities.
Right, characteristics. So, this would be a characteristic or like a classification of a type of evil or something like that. And so you could say so and so has this characteristic of an Attila. But even there, you run into the problem that Attila is operating on this absolute principle of being a brute. And that's probably not the case with the person you're trying to describe in real life. So you're just going to run into this rationalism all the time if you start with the fantasy. But I
Right.
also wanted to bring up, and this was brought to my attention by a friend of the show in an email, that this article for the New Intellectual is one of Rand's very early philosophical works. And I believe that at the time she wrote this, which was in 1961, um, she didn't fully appreciate evolution, the theory of evolution. Um, in fact, in Galt's speech in 1957 in Atlas Shrugged, she referred to man as a rational being, like a human being, but a rational being. And it wasn't until she started writing her articles on epistemology in 1966 that she explicitly embraced the definition of man as a rational animal. Um, and then even up until 1973, she was admitting in her article, The Missing Link, that she wasn't a student of evolution. And so she didn't support it or disagree with it. She didn't have an opinion on it. So it's kind of weird that she never became a student of evolution. She never took that seriously. And I think that's a problem. And I think it exposes a sort of vestige of religion that she had. The religious view that man was created and is not part of the animal kingdom.
I'm not sure how much of it is a religious view on her part, but going back to this idea of social hierarchy, that one of the main things they try to do is tell you who to read and who not to read. And I think there was probably, even in Russia, such a visceral reaction against Darwin that there were probably just a bunch of taboos put on reading him.
That could be the case. I didn't think of that, but yeah, she also came out of communist Russia, so that could be the case.
And
There's
there
also
are people that question, evolution, just if it goes exactly the way Darwin says versus, we just there's still things we don't know.
listen to this quote. Um, she says, "If quote if a missing link between the human and the animal species is to be found, Attila and the Witch Doctor are that missing link." Here she's making a differentiation between human and animal species, but animal is not a species, it's a kingdom. So she's kind of like still at this stage when she's writing for the New Intellectual, she's still working on that understanding from Galt's speech, where there's this sort of dichotomy, this loose dichotomy between man and animal. And then when
Right.
you
She puts a definite, I think that's what she's saying by species. There's the human species, then there's all the other species.
yeah, she's trying to make a differentiation, but I think it's too much. she's not appreciating how close we are to the higher animals like the chimpanzee. I was going to say something else too. Even in a later article she wrote on the objectivist ethics, she very all throughout that essay she talks about, you know, what animals could do versus what man can do.
Yeah.
And
I
and
think
she
she didn't appreciate the kind of sliding scale of cognition and that happens in, you know, like Coco signing, things like that. It, she just saw a very clear cutoff that, you know, no other animals could do anything approaching thinking. I mean, you see your dog doing some things that approaches it, but yeah, I think that she kind of needed it to see humans as special. And you could say that is a kind of religious, I don't know if that's where she got it from, but the idea of a divine spark that kind of separates humans.
yeah, I think she wasn't a creationist, but I think she thought that nature had done something special to separate humans and put them above the animal kingdom. And so she would use terms like subhuman to refer to people like her Attilas and her witch doctors, and because they hadn't shown the requisite um, ability to reason. You know, there's a certain level of rationality you need to achieve, and then you're part of the human kingdom. But if you're still at what she would consider the perceptual level, and you hadn't quite reached the proper conceptual level, you're subhuman. And I think that that was an early mistake. And I think she kind of corrected it by the time she wrote her, you know, introduction to objectivist epistemology.
Right.
But I'm not sure, I'm not quite sure, I haven't done all of the homework here. I'm not quite sure when she, if or ever she stopped using that term subhuman and started coming up with some sort of concept to classify people who didn't quite think at the appropriate conceptual level.
It's now no longer politically correct to say it. So
Yeah.
but you know, I mean that used to, you know, she used, I know she used the term parasite before, and I saw old videos of Hitler using that term. Not that, you know, I'm not comparing her to a Nazi by any means, but I'm just saying that some of those, you know, terms that we just, you know, people thought were just normal ways to describe your enemy, then, you know, if Hitler used it, it's like out forever.
Yeah. It's
No one can do
unfortunate.
that mustache anymore either.
Yeah, I know. And the woke crowd are doing that to words today as well. And you
Exactly.
can barely talk about man and women or men and
Right.
women.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these genders now.
Well, in this third clip, she talks about how Attila and the witch doctor have had an alliance.
All through history, all major cultures, with very few exceptions, were ruled by an alliance of the man of faith, that is the witch doctor, with the man of force, which is the Attila. The witch doctor provided the goals and the values and the moral sanction for Attila to enforce in the world. And in today's world, you see the same phenomenon in allegedly civilized terms, but the essence remains the same: a dictator, which is the Attila, a man like Khrushchev, and his political theorists, the modern leftist, liberal, socialist intellectuals, who are philosophically Attilaists. They, in effect, provide an allegedly non-mystical moral justification, a philosophical justification for Attila and for the rule of brute force. I call them the neo-mystics, because they're as much against the validity of reason as were the original jungle witch doctors.
Well, it's certainly interesting how she describes this alliance, you know, between the man of faith and the man of force. I think that exists to some extent in some societies where you don't have a very good set of leaders, or I mean a very um, broad set of leaders, you know, where they where they can do a lot of different things or multitask. So
Right.
if someone's only good at wielding force, then he needs a witch doctor. But I think there are some cases in history, like maybe with Hitler even, where you had this sort of thinker and brute combined together. And that's kind of why Hitler's this arch example of evil. It's because he was the package of both the Attila and the witch doctor. Um, he
Yeah, it
was
was
willing
definitely
to,
more his philosophy that wasn't the kind of Christian philosophy of older kings.
yeah, he sort of came up with the ideas, and then he was the political leader who implemented them and was willing to do terrible, forceful things. He didn't just sit back and write books. So um, that might be the case is where, and then maybe in, I don't know how it was in Russia exactly, but maybe you had less of that in Russia.
Well, it's interesting she called Khrushchev Attila, which I mean is probably fair as the leader of the Soviet Union, but to his credit, he did denounce Stalin's crimes, and he may have actually been taken out eventually for it. But I mean, who would be the actual Attilas of today? How do we make that call? I mean, I think some in the political class are actually much quieter in their compulsion. It never even makes the news, or if it does, they'll claim to be fighting misinformation to get intellectuals to defend censorship.
Well, I think the problem with today is that the people who can actually use force and the people who are of great faith, they're in the background mostly now. Like you got Biden, who's neither of them. He's just a puppet. So we don't. So who's pulling the strings? And who's giving ideas to the puppet master? So it's not as clear anymore because they're not out in the open. They're like buried in the universities or buried in the streets. I think people the people who are protesting and marching and rioting in the streets, they're probably a sort of like Voltron of Attila. They're the ones who are using the force. And then you have little leaders, the leaders of Antifa and the leaders of BLM, and they're kind of the ones pushing the ideas, into the real world. And the idea makers on the left are just these crazy people in the institutions and the universities who are teaching these rioters. So,
Right.
and then the ideas just sort of flow into the White House occasionally, but pretty much are the actual establishment in the White House is they're only really good, I guess, for international relations. Like other countries have to kind of deal with the White House, but when it comes to domestic matters, it seems to me like the teachers at the universities and the kids on the street rioting, they're the ones who are pretty much doing the damage.
Yeah, but it tends to be directed from somewhere. I just wanted to go back for a minute and share a quick anecdote while we were talking about Attilas and Khrushchev and Stalin, Hitler, and um, Boris Pasternak is the man who wrote Dr. Zhivago in like I think in Khrushchev's time, and they still didn't want it released, but it was. But even before that, in the early days, he was an intellectual, and he in the before Stalin really consolidated his power in 1938, he had arrested an intellectual, Mandelstam, for putting out a Stalin epigram, and then Pasternak relates this story of getting a phone call in his apartment, and a voice on the Kremlin says, "Comrade Stalin wishes to speak to you." And Pasternak, he was unprepared. He didn't know if he was being arrested or shot or whatever. And then Stalin comes on the line and says, "Tell me, what are they saying in your literary circles about the arrest of Mandelstam?" It's like this, even this mass murderer is still worried about what the intellectual salons are saying about
Yeah.
him. And maybe that's part of the power of intellectuals, at least, you know, for communism.
Yeah, well, even a dictator, has to appeal to a certain element of the population. Otherwise they're going to turn the people against him. So, and maybe he's just looking for people he needs to silence, but in the first place, he's looking for knowledge, right? He's looking, what are the people saying about me? What are the idea spreaders, the intellectuals and the elites? What are and the teachers? What are they saying? Because even this evil guy, he knows, he knows what's up. He knows that he needs to control the spread of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, assuming that these people that are scared to death of him are going to be able to tell him the truth anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting balance to explore. Like how does a dictator know when someone's afraid, telling them something because they're afraid, or telling them something because they just want to inform him, or they're loyal or disloyal? I mean, that's when you're in that world, it's like the mafia, right? You can't trust anybody.
Absolutely. That's basically what it was. Stalin started out as a bank robber. I wanted to just do a couple of quotes from the essay itself, just to go over a couple of the comments. This is by no means going to be exhaustive. We're not even going to play all this, read all the slides we prepared, but I thought it might be good to at least explore a couple of these ideas. It starts off: when a man, a business corporation, or an entire society is approaching bankruptcy, there are two courses that those involved can follow. They can evade the reality of their situation and act on a frantic, blind, range of the moment expediency, not daring to look ahead, wishing no one would name the truth, yet desperately hoping that something will save them somehow. Or they can identify the situation, check their premises, discover their hidden assets, and start rebuilding. She says we're pursuing the first course right now. And like the child telling the emperor he's naked, she declares that America is culturally bankrupt.
Right. So one of the big themes of this article is that America is basically done. It's the idea is over. We're bankrupt. These new intellectuals need to come in and create a new culture, a better culture. Um,
Right. The first question
and
that comes to my mind is, did it get better or worse since then?
yeah, so are we in the process of creating that new culture right now? I mean, are we still bankrupt? Um,
Yeah. What are the consequences of 50 years of cultural bankruptcy or longer?
yeah, I mean, how has America survived being bankrupt for that long? And are we really not bankrupt? And there's half of the country is still, surviving and producing and flourishing, while the other one is just a parasite living off of the producers. So, in my view, we're in this great culture war, and basically half of the country is still working on the foundations of America. They have some values, some American values that propel them forward, and then the other half are just these socialist bastards who are trying to take everything, rob the good producers of everything they got. And it's just getting worse and worse, because the producers aren't fighting back. They're basically just taking it on the chin.
Not
And
just that, I think that was happening towards the end of her life when she was trying to rally business people. At this point, some are actually, enthusiastic participants in a public private partnership.
yeah, you got some traders, who are still working with the established culture, which is dying or dead. And then they're basically paying for life support for the left. or the socialists or whatever you want to call them. And then you've got the people on the right who are finally, I think, trying to break free and form their own cultural institutions. And that's, to me, the best sign. You know, that's a sign that we are launching into this new era where people are trying to rebuild the culture, rebuild a healthy culture. Of course, it's still a little flawed because they're objectivists for some reason don't want to ally with the right and help them out and try to become part of that culture. Most objectivists are still riding the fence, trying to work both sides, floundering in the middle somewhere, trying to form their own little Mickey Mouse culture. But really, I think to what we need to do is to just help the right win, and then within the right, solar system or atmosphere or whatever culture, whatever you got over there on the right, then we work from within that to improve it.
Yeah, it's a very early stage, and I think to some extent we're conceding the existing governing apparatus to those that are still governing us.
Yeah.
Well, this next quote I think is a little bit controversial. The professional intellectual is the field agent of the army whose commander in chief is the philosopher. The intellectual carries the application of philosophical principles to every field of human endeavor. He sets a society's course by transmitting ideas from the ivory tower of the philosopher to the university professor, to the writer, to the artist, to the newspaper man, to the politician, to the movie maker, to the nightclub singer, to the man in the street. So is she saying that, the nightclub singer is an intellectual?
No, she's saying that the nightclub singer is influenced by this chain of spreaders of the ideas. So eventually, some ivory tower idea will get to the nightclub singer through the chain of people that she's in contact with.
And does she mean it through the song or through interviews where this nightclub singer will be giving their opinion on political topics?
I don't know. could be anything, any way she gets ideas or hears them.
I guess I also I don't like a military hierarchy analogy where I can't question the philosopher or even the notion that intellectuals are basically representing a particular philosopher. I mean, even if that may have been true about characters in Atlas Shrugged, you could maybe say they represent different pieces of different philosophers. I mean, I'm influenced by Maslow and other thinkers besides Rand as well, but that's
Well, I don't think she's denying that. She's just trying to describe the process through which ideas are spread, and it could be any idea. And then you can pick and choose whatever ideas you like and want to be influenced by or apply to your own life. So, I mean, I don't think that's something that she denies. It's just
but
she's
it's
just
almost
trying
just like she's conceding an ivory tower for the philosopher. And
yeah,
even the university professor's the ivory tower.
yeah. I mean, that's just like a
That's why I look back on it and I don't like the idea. I think that's kind of where that top down mentality you were describing earlier comes from, especially among the establishment groups.
Sure, I see your point. I'm just saying that's generally how it probably happened back then. But then once you develop the cultural distaste for these intellectuals, then they start looking to street wisdom or street prophets, or they get their ideas somewhere else. But then where did those people get their ideas? I mean, it's you rarely find some unlearned person spreading like new ideas. it happens, I'm sure. Some person who hasn't been influenced by the university could probably come up with some new idea, but I mean, it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to come up with a system of ideas. Most of the great systems have already been partially or almost fully formed, and it's unlikely you're going to find some new system out there on the street or wherever you get your ideas, like Jerry Springer, or I don't know, where do you think people get most of their genuine ideas?
I mean, probably people that aren't, intellectuals. It's just from the social media and stories that other people that do care link to. You have friends that are influencers, or you want to make them like you.
Yeah, so I think there's two main influences for people when they're growing up. When you're a child and you're learning ideas and you're learning morals, you get it from your parents, your friends, or your teachers, right? Um, Occasionally, I guess you could get them from the movies if there's a really influential movie you're watching and you learn something from it. But then, where did the person who wrote that screenplay get his ideas? And it's this big chain of influence, and generally the new ideas come out of the universities, and like, but then occasionally I'm sure they come from somewhere else, from churches, theologians, a bunch of different types of institutions of learning. They have their own intellectuals who come
Right.
up with
That's
ideas.
why Rand and Yaron were worried about the universities. And so basically, who's been dominating universities the last 50 or so years?
Right. So, I mean, I think the question is, where should objectivists put their energy into? Is it worth trying to get into the universities to teach the students, or is your time better served knocking on doors like Mormons, going door to door spreading ideas?
I think there's other ways. I mean, there's other things she was listing as, you can become a nightclub singer, um, or
Yeah,
a
and
cobbler.
you could go into the arts, and that's a valid way to do it. I mean, that's how Rand did it.
Right.
So,
But I mean, she kind of combined being a novelist philosopher. Um, there
so she's
is,
an example of the person who is both the idea creator and the idea spreader, like I was talking about before. Like, so that's why the archetypes don't really work, as a perfect representation of these classifications of people, because people can be both, or all three. They could be a creator of ideas, a spreader of ideas, and a user of ideas. So
sure,
you can have the package, or you can just be one or the other. But Rand was both. Well,
triple threat.
she was all three, I guess, because she wrote nonfiction essays as well.
I
But
just Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I do have this just this one more that I want to read. I'm not even going to put the slide up, but I think you're familiar with this. It's on this fundamental division of labor and responsibility that the intellectual has defaulted. His twin brother, the businessman, has done a superlative job and brought men to an unprecedented material prosperity. But the intellectual has sold him out, betrayed their common source, failed in his own job, and brought men to spiritual bankruptcy. So she's saying that the intellectual has failed. And so, from that perspective, I think that, people like Elon Musk have served as something of an intellectual, not just by buying Twitter, but even just his public commentary, whether you agree with it or not. He is an influence.
right. Well, the essay is pretty much a screed against current intellectuals over time. But she's also
Saying these new
trying
ones
to
will be great, though.
influence new ones, or like tell people, you gotta go out there and become the new intellectuals. But in terms of like saying that the intellectuals have failed the businessmen, I think that comes from her capitalistic view of the division of labor. So she has this idea that in a society, it's hard to be both the thinker and the distributor and the user of ideas. You know, you can't. It's hard to be the philosopher and the businessman and the inventor. You
But,
know, so
I just think that that has been used to elevate the intellectuals from some objectivists into being this, holy thing that the businessman can't be without. But per Rand, I mean, they have been without it.
so it could be the case that the new intellectuals are actually the businessmen who subscribe to her philosophy. So
Or that are
maybe,
just being rational at least.
or yeah, I mean, or the inventor of new ideas based on her philosophy. So I think that I don't think she narrowed the category of new intellectual to just like full blown philosophers in the university. So that might be ARI's mistake, is that they're trying to pump the universities full of objectivist, intellectuals or philosophers, when they probably should have been working on new ideas within the philosophy. Like, why don't they fund more of these neo-Randians who are using the philosophy to come up with new ideas?
They spent
And
so much time bashing anyone who came up with anything new. How can they do that now?
they're so afraid of sanctioning something bad that they just don't sanction, they don't fund anything.
They don't take action.
Or they fund things that they think are just perfectly in line with Rand.
Right.
So it's very hard as a rebellious or critical thinker to work your way into that orbit around ARI, because they just reject you. They don't want anything to do with people who criticize Rand.
And to their credit, you could say they're being consistent. They've modeled their whole approach where they say that all they're doing is trying to build new intellectuals. Now, I've charged that that's kind of a stalling tactic, but they are being they're trying. They at least say, and they're creating these classes that are going to create new intellectuals. And Alex Smith was just the first one, and wait till you see what's next.
Yeah, well, how long do we have to wait?
100 years by some estimates.
I mean, when you got ARI intellectuals promoting things like open borders, it's just, it's hard to accept that they're doing much positive. They're coming up with these fanciful ideas which they think are in line with Rand, but like they're coming up with ideas that are completely absurd,
Well,
and they don't
I don't know.
accept.
Rand talked about immigration, but it was more personal with her, and you know,
Well, they conveniently leave out her context, and then go off on a tangent which is not supportable, you know, by reality. So they'll choose Rand over reality half the time. So you rarely get a strong objective based or fact based argument. You'll get it, they'll quote Rand and then they'll launch off of what Rand said, as if,
right.
as if she's the gospel. So it's hard to deal with people like that. They don't look at your evidence. Like, so when you criticize somebody and you have you point out an obvious error, you don't get a response. They don't react to you. So it kind of stunts the conversation.
Well, we'll do shows on Rand and immigration. Shows on we have some shows on Rand being an introvert. We'll do a second half of this show on some of the implications for her view of history, and when she's calling for what she's actually calling for, and what that means today. Any final thoughts on what we've talked about to here?
Well, I just like to emphasize that Rand had a historical context, and so I appreciate that, and so I limit my criticism to her of her, based on what I thought she knew. So she didn't study evolution; she admitted to that, and so I think that within her context, she was a genius when she came up with this interpretation of the intellectual history of philosophy and culture and how ideas work through a culture. It was a great success on her part to describe these archetypes, um, which I use now to figure out what I think is like a better description of how things work.
Right.
So you knowledge is based on prior knowledge, and so I can't falter very much for using this top-down approach because that's all she had. She wasn't able to form the bottom-up approach because she didn't study evolution. She didn't study the way man is very close to animal, um, and so she didn't have that knowledge. But
And,
she
and
had a grasp of the need to describe this, to figure this out, and that's what's
right.
important. She had this orientation towards figuring things out in objective reality.
Didn't the Brandons, she's credited the Brandons with helping her come up with the ideas, maybe Nathaniel?
Right. I mean, I don't know how important this is, but she does give a little note or footnote that Nathaniel Brandon designated the archetypes Attila and the Witch Doctor, and he basically came up with this idea. So he had a great influence over her, um,
Over the movement.
when she was writing this article, right? And then, of
Sure.
course, they had the breakup, and I think so after '68, I think she started rethinking some of this stuff, and that's why you see this sort of development in her thinking about the concept of man. Um,
Yeah.
but there's another quote I wanted to bring up real quick, on that aspect where she had this sort of dichotomy between man and animals. Um, I forget where I got this quote, but it might be in For the New. Yeah, it's in For the New Intellectual. I think on page 9. She says, "Animals survive by adjusting themselves to their background. Man survives by adjusting his background to himself." Now, if she understood like evolution and studied biology and what animals do, she would have known that that's an imperfect generalization because animals do adjust their background. Ants burrow in the dirt to create their colonies. Beavers manipulate wood to make their dams. Animals are constantly adjusting their background. And it's not just man that does this.
Yeah.
Man does it to a much greater degree than most animals, or I guess all animals. I can't think of
Yeah.
maybe.
I like your characterization of it being an imperfect generalization.
Yeah, I
Um,
think there's some evidence that chimpanzees might create like tools, or some animals will create little tools, but just the way she framed it, adjusting their background, almost all animals do that. So it's so if she understood evolution and biological habits, she'd understand that there's this very close relationship with other animals, and I think that she would have benefited greatly in her theory if she understood that.
well, she might have had a tougher time fighting PETA. No, I'm kidding. But this is good stuff. We'll see what kind of reaction we get in the comments. And like I said, we're going to revisit this essay again. So, but good stuff. I think we talked about some good ideas, and we'll look forward to the feedback.
Yeah, definitely.
Again, uh, I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. This has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club, and we will see you next time.